When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like aloe or skins, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and brilliant marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does selling better than Shopify. With Shop Pay, that boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts are going abandoned and way more sales happening. So if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell whatever your customers are scrolling or strolling on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Skins uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/Westwood1, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/Westwood1 to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/Westwood1.
This podcast is sponsored by Talkspace. You know when you're really stressed or not feeling so great about your life or about yourself? Talking to someone who understands can really help. But who is that person? How do you find them? Where do you even start? Talkspace. Talkspace makes it easy to get the support you need. With Talkspace, you can go online, answer a few questions about your preferences, and be matched with a therapist. And because you'll meet your therapist online, you don't have to take time off work or arrange childcare. You'll meet on your schedule, wherever you feel most at ease. If you're depressed, stressed, struggling with a relationship, or if you want some counseling for you and your partner, or just need a little extra one-on-one support, Talkspace is here for you. Plus, Talkspace works with most major insurers, and most insured members have a $0 copay. No insurance? No problem. Now get $80 off of your first month with promo code SPACE80 when you go to Talkspace.com. Match with a licensed therapist today at Talkspace.com. Save $80 with code SPACE80 at Talkspace.com.
Welcome to the Covert Narcissism Podcast. I'm your host, Renee Swanson. I am not a therapist, and you are not a victim. I want to welcome you back to part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. If you missed part 1, last week's episode, I highly encourage you to start there. We laid a very powerful foundation for unpacking shame, where it comes from, how it distorts our sense of self, and why it's so often misunderstood, especially in the context of covert narcissistic abuse. Today, we are shifting gears to talk about guilt, what it is, how it's different from shame, and why so many survivors carry guilt that was never truly theirs. Dr. Mazzella helps us to explore how guilt can be both a signal of conscience and a weapon used against us. We will talk about how guilt is internalized, how it gets tangled up with trauma, and what it takes to start letting go of the guilt that keeps us stuck. This is a powerful and liberating conversation, so let's pick it up where we left off. So looking at the other side of this, what is guilt?
So guilt so remember the first place we started with shame was that it starts very early in life. Now, typically, and I love to hear your theory on guilt as well as we get into that, Renee. But guilt starts a little bit later, and the research shows this too. So from a psychodynamic lens, guilt arises from a conflict between internalized values. So that's good. So you're internalizing the values. This is what we call in my field, like the superego, like the sort of part of your brain or your mind that looks over to see if you're meeting certain morals and values and expectations. And there's a conflict, right? And that's why there's guilt. So you have internalized something good, morals and values. And then there's a conflict with one's own wishes, actions, thoughts, or behaviors, right? So you're not being exposed. It's not like your sense of self is so worthless, but it's that you're violating your own internal standard, which is good because now you have an internal standard, you see? Or here's the second definition of it, and we could zoom in on these as we go along. So that's the first one is you're violating some inner standard. And the second one is you're causing harm to somebody that you care about. So guilt says, I did something wrong, and I care about the impact of my action and what it did to you, Renee, let's say in this example, right? Or a man lashes out against his wife, and he says things that are intentionally hurtful, let's say, right? But when he steps back and he reflects on it, he says, that I hurt my wife, and this is somebody that I love and I care about them. And this
Mhm.
is not a good feeling. So then what I need to do, and he'll have a conflict because I was so angry at her because of the
Mhm.
way she did this, but I love her and she didn't deserve this kind of treatment. So guilt emerges then from seeing that conflict and then wanting to what we could call repair the damage that you've created. So
Mhm.
that's sort of a few different ways to look at guilt. And I'm curious to hear how you think of it or if this sounds familiar to you at all.
Very much so. Yeah, I think of guilt as unlike shame, I think of guilt as being a feeling that
Mhm.
is a driving feeling that motivates us to repair, fix, restore, any of those kind of, that direction. Whereas shame, like we talked about earlier, becomes more of an experience and more of an identity based. I don't think of guilt as being that. Guilt is more tied to our actions or our behaviors or even the thoughts we have, but it is then inside we are assessing whether we believe that what we did was right or wrong. We're
Yes.
not assessing whether I'm a good or bad person. I'm not
Yeah.
assessing my identity, but I'm assessing that action, that behavior, was
Yeah.
it right or wrong?
So now we need to go one step further. This is what differentiates it from shame because like, you could say, I did something wrong, but then what do you do with that? You see, that's the
Mhm.
critical piece of guilt as well, because guilt is tied to empathy, and that's the ability to manage somebody else's pain. And like I mentioned, and you're saying, the desire to repair it. So
Mhm.
that's really, so you have to not just apologize, because plenty of people with these narcissistic traits they have no problem apologizing, but nothing changes. So
Right.
it's not just the apology, it's the acknowledgement that he hurt you, right?
Mhm.
That in this example, he hurt his wife, right? And then that he's taking the steps to either say, you know what, you're right. You mentioned that I tend to become quite angry and belligerent when I'm drinking. I think I need to deal with my drinking. Or maybe I need to deal with my aggressive behavior and I need to talk to somebody. See, now that's a reparative effort. It's not just saying I'm sorry and this won't happen again. That's not enough. And guilt,
Mhm.
that's healthy guilt, by the way.
Mhm.
It goes
Yes.
a little bit further than that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's why it's a developmental achievement and it happens later, just so you know, than shame, because now you're able to recognize the other person as separate from you, which many people with these narcissistic characteristics who have shame and narcissism are like, they go hand in hand,
Mhm.
as we mentioned earlier. But when there's shame and narcissism, there's no other, there's no separate
Mhm.
other.
Mhm.
You feel like your sense of worth has collapsed, but that has nothing to do with somebody else or
Right.
repairing the fact that you hurt them. Yeah, go ahead,
Right,
please.
and you don't know how to repair. Like, people who are
Yeah,
trapped in that, they can't get to it's like they can't get to the next stage, okay, of emotional growth, emotional development, emotional maturity, and like what you're saying, guilt definitely, often at least motivates towards repair, okay,
yes.
healthy guilt. Healthy guilt will motivate you towards not just apologies, like you said, but change behavior and growth, whereas guilt I think of as being a motivating emotion, a motivating experience,
Mhm.
whereas shame is the complete opposite of that. Shame just destroys motivation. It
Yes.
destroys any kind of forward momentum or forward motion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing you become motivated for, if I could think of one, is it's all about you with shame, you
Mhm.
see? It's like a regression back into the self. So you could
Mhm.
start beating yourself up and then maybe somebody will come and rescue you. But the point is, it's no longer organized. Like guilt is organized around somebody else as a separate
Mhm.
person with their own
Mhm.
feelings. And you're right, shame is just about you and not growth promoting because having and repairing a relationship, yeah, that's a sign of growth for
Absolutely.
sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. So where does guilt originate? We talked about where shame originates from. Where does
Yes.
guilt originate?
So it's actually since it starts a little bit later, it's again in the research, it's thought to start like maybe around age 5 or 6, and that still seems pretty early. But there's really good research out there to show that even at that early age, that the child is beginning to internalize the values and morals of the family. And more importantly, they're beginning to understand and have a capacity for concern. So, like
Mhm.
if you look at any kind of play therapy, for example, with kids, their behaviors will begin to indicate that they're experiencing guilt, even at that early age. So, what does that look like? So, if they destroy something in play, you may see them trying to repair it, right?
Mhm.
If they do something that they know hurts somebody else, like they stole a toy, they may actually have the capacity to apologize for it. So, in other
Mhm.
words, in short, they're developing empathy, which is necessary for guilt. And they're beginning to see the other person as separate and what we call whole. And I won't go down this too much because this is a little bit of too much theory, but basically the difference between shame and guilt is part object relations. In other words, in part object relations, that's shame. Somebody's there just to meet your needs. And if they don't meet your needs, you have every right to be furious with them, right? Or to shame them or
Mhm.
humiliate them because why? Because they deserve it. Okay.
Right.
So then with guilt, we think of it as relating to whole objects. Another that just means another person, but that means that they're not just there to meet your needs anymore, that they have thoughts, feelings of their own that
Mhm.
could be different than yours. And that's very painful, but it doesn't give you the right to destroy what they believe or feel.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think part of what you're expressing here is the development of the ability to recognize another person's feelings, but also their boundaries.
Hmm.
That there are boundaries that are in place for that person. So when it's a shame-based thinking, you have hurt me, therefore now it's my get out of jail free card. I can treat you however I please. Okay.
Yes.
But when it's guilt-based and you have hurt me, there are still boundaries in place. Even though
Yeah.
you have hurt me, I am still taking care of, you know, making sure that this repair happens with your feelings and your boundaries being cared for too.
Right. And when you say boundaries, I think this is what you mean, but let me just check. The boundary is between self and other. In other words, there's another person. It's not a merged, or to use your
Mhm,
word from earlier, like enmeshed or codependent relationship. So a
mhm.
boundary doesn't mean I'm holding you at a distance, but it's that I respect where I end and you begin. So there are
Absolutely.
two people in the relationship instead of just one.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I've got an analogy that I use a lot with if you draw up a circle inside a circle, so it looks like an egg and a yolk.
Hmm.
And a child growing up, that yolk is the child's identity is completely consumed in the parent's identity.
Hmm.
Okay? Any
Hmm.
child, they go where mom and dad go, they like what they like, they do the things that they do. And then as they form into their own person, the two circles start to separate. So now we have like a Venn diagram where you've
Hmm.
got two circles that overlap some.
Yes.
And you've got this identity and the parent's identity and the child, so maybe a teenager's identity, there's still some overlap. And then as we come into healthy adulthood, we have two circles, and that being each other's identities, and those are the boundaries that you get to exist, like what you said, is yourself. I recognize where I stop and you start. Okay,
Hmm.
those are the boundaries that are separated. When we get enmeshed back into a narcissistic relationship, a marriage, in a narcissistic relationship, it's like that process reverses. It becomes a little bit enmeshed, and ultimately you become again the egg and the yolk, and your entire identity is enmeshed within that narcissistic person. And
Yeah.
so that is what I'm referring to with boundaries is knowing where I start and stop and where others start and stop.
Yeah. I would, can I comment on your
Absolutely.
okay. So when you
Absolutely.
get into adulthood, I would just visualize it slightly differently. So instead of two separate sort of boundaried whatever
Circles. Yeah.
separate circle, yeah, a sign of healthy development would be that there's a togetherness that does overlap at times, and then a separateness, and that you feel it's a fluidity, in other words, that
Yes.
you feel comfortable enough merging at certain moments. Think about sexual intimacy, right? How intense that could get, or
Yes.
feeling deep empathy for somebody. So you have to have that. You don't want to be too separate. You want to have the fluidity where you could step in, but more importantly, unlike the earlier when you said you regress, but to be able to step out. And
Mhm.
that's really part of therapy too. The deep sort of psychoanalytic work, a psychodynamic work that I do, it's never that like completely separate image that you described in adulthood. As a good therapist, you have to be able to step in. And I talk about this quite a bit in my podcast, and people really have strong feelings about it, in terms of when you're working with a narcissist. And an example I use quite a bit is the vulnerable narcissist who's living at home and is living like a parasitic life off, living off of his parents. And I always emphasize containment and helping the child, not creating a boundary or kicking him or her out. I mean, at some point, you may have to do that if they just become too abusive, but initially containing, stepping in, holding, and
Mhm.
people really object to that. And part, like you said, Renee, I think in that image is like we feel like we need to be so separate from these people, but a
Mhm.
sign of health is to be able to step in and step out. So that's the only
Absolutely.
thought that
Well,
yeah,
and back in that analogy, and I didn't talk through all of it here,
yeah.
but I do talk about how that in between, up here you've got two separate circles, down here you have the egg and the yolk. In between is the
This podcast is sponsored by Talkspace. You know, when you're really stressed or not feeling so great about your life or about yourself, talking to someone who understands can really help. But who is that person? How do you find them? Where do you even start? Talkspace. Talkspace makes it easy to get the support you need. With Talkspace, you can go online, answer a few questions about your preferences, and be matched with a therapist. And because you'll meet your therapist online, you don't have to take time off work or arrange childcare. You'll meet on your schedule, wherever you feel most at ease. If you're depressed, stressed, struggling with a relationship, or if you want some counseling for you and your partner, or just need a little extra one-on-one support, Talkspace is here for you. Plus, Talkspace works with most major insurers, and most insured members have a $0 copay. No insurance? No problem. Now get $80 off of your first month with promo code SPACE80 when you go to Talkspace.com. Match with a licensed therapist today at Talkspace.com. Save $80 with code SPACE80 at Talkspace.com.
this overlap that
Yes.
it fluctuates.
Yeah, that's so
Sometimes
important.
it's gonna overlap more than others. Sometimes you feel more connected and other times you don't.
Yeah.
But that's a healthy space.
And by the way, in case anyone's wondering, so how does guilt develop? I mentioned at the age it develops, internalizing morals and values. But this is actually the most important piece of guilt is that you have a parent that when you do something, excuse my language, stupid, which kids do, they're not made to feel stupid.
Yeah.
That's the main thing is that you could sit down and put your arm on them and say, listen, you knocked down little Susie's blocks. Like what was going on? Or you can't be hit. It's understandable. I appreciate that you got angry with Susie. We all get angry, but you can't knock down her block. So you're doing it
Mhm.
in sort of a firm way, but you're stepping into their world, down at their level, maybe your hand on their shoulder. That's
Mhm.
kind of the merging or that fluidity that I just mentioned. Because as a parent, of course, you're going to have your own feelings if your child is behaving aggressively. Who
Mhm.
knows what they may be? But if you have your own guilt or superego or
Or
internalized morals,
shame. Mhm.
or shame, exactly, and that's the other
Yeah.
side. Because most parents, believe it or not, well, I don't want to say most, but because of the adults that I work with, of course, I have a biased sample because they're in therapy, but they shame the kid. That's right.
Right.
What's wrong with you? Like you always mess everything up, and that's
Mhm.
the kind of reaction that, of course, will lead to shame instead of guilt.
Of course. And it
Yeah.
will lead then to defensive behaviors coming from that child.
Because you have no choice, right?
Right.
That goes back to what we said before.
Right.
That's adaptive.
Right.
And they're automatic, they're not even thought of, and then in comes all the defenses that go along with shame, which is the splitting and the projection and making other people feel
Right.
just as humiliated as you once felt, but you don't wanna feel again, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
No, when you go down a path as a child feeling unsafe, this is where I come back to it being a threat response. That's you lose your emotional safety when you are being
Mm.
told by your parent, the one that you've put on the pedestal, that you're being told, what's wrong with you? Why can't you ever do anything right? And so you're being told that you're bad and you're unworthy and all of this. That is a threat to you emotionally, but it's also a threat to your own identity.
Yes.
And so you have to reestablish a sense of safety somehow. And in order to reestablish that sense of safety, then is where people turn or children turn to the defensive behaviors we mentioned, such as, splitting, like you've mentioned, and projecting and the people pleasing. Like, I'm just going to kick it into people pleasing mode and I'll do everything to keep that parent happy. That way
Mhm.
I can feel worthy again. And so it's a
Yes.
sense of trying to reestablish safety.
Yep, yep.
Yeah.
And it's sad because you mentioned it affects your identity, and that's exactly right. And
Hmm.
one of the definitions of a personality disorder, the object relation school call it identity diffusion. In other words, you don't know what your identity is because from this early age, you're engaging in these really early defenses, like we call them primitive defenses, not in a pejorative way, but that they start really early
Uh-huh.
before you could begin to establish your identity. So you don't know who you are. Where guilt, to go back just to comparing the two, since
Sure.
it starts later and you internalize, remember that's where I started with morals and values, you already have a sense of identity. It's
Uh-huh.
establishing or getting established, let's put it that way. It's
It's in
not
the process.
consolidated. Yeah, it
Hmm.
consolidates later on in, adolescence, where you
Hmm.
have another opportunity at this. That's why I mentioned a teacher or a coach, because you really do get another opportunity at internalizing a good object. And what
Yeah.
I mean by sorry, I slipped it. I always go back into the sort of psychoanalytic language. A good person, right?
Mhm.
A coach, a supportive one who's going to sit down and maybe not shame you because that's sort of that's like the a critical moment because what happens if you get that shaming response like what's wrong with you? Now you don't have guilt. You at best would have what we call toxic guilt, which is
Mhm.
bordering on shame because you it's part of your identity now. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that leads us right into the next question, which is we've talked a couple of times about healthy guilt. We've used that phrase a few times, and now you're bringing in, this toxic guilt or
Yes.
pathological guilt.
Yeah.
What's the difference? How do we distinguish that difference?
So, in some cases where, again, early on, where kids are abused or chronically criticized or judged or shamed, all the things that we're describing, they don't develop this stable sense of self, which means they don't have a capacity for healthy guilt,
Hmm.
right? Because there's no self and other. That's a big part of guilt, right? So, what happens then, they might emotionally cut off. In other words, they're unable to feel remorse. They they would remorse, feeling remorse that you hurt somebody and you want to repair it means that you're concerned about them. Remember, you care about the other person.
Right.
Again, a developmental achievement only if there's enough love and empathy to
And
get to
safety.
that point. Yes, and safety.
Mm-hmm.
So without that, guilt gets replaced with instead rage, numbness, or what we call identification with the aggressor, which means you become aggressive because you internalize now an aggressive, angry,
Okay.
parental figure of some sort. So then what happens is this is the pathological guilt or what we call toxic guilt. And there are a couple of ways to think about it, and we'll go as far as you want, Renee. But one of them is the absence of guilt, okay? And the other one is the overcompensation of guilt. So, one, you have no guilt, and the other one, you have too much guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And it can go either way depending on the level of disturbance. So, the most modern research or contemporary research shows that children who experience abuse and neglect are more likely to develop what they call callous on emotional traits. Callous on emotional traits. That's what they call it. But basically, that means there's a lack of guilt. They don't care. So if they hurt somebody, it's that attitude that I mentioned earlier, like they deserved it anyway. Like, who really cares if they're suffering? Look what's been done to me. So
Mm-hmm.
that's really a lack of guilt. And that's the one way to think of pathological guilt. And that's quite destructive. That's
Well,
even
it
more
is,
destructive.
and
Yeah.
that kind of sits side by side with a lack of empathy.
Mhm.
So if guilt is our way of starting to see people outside of us and their feelings and their needs, does that mean that guilt and empathy, the development of guilt and the development of empathy are closely tied?
Yeah, they go hand in hand. It's like if you're going to have concern for somebody else, you have to have a capacity for empathy.
Mhm.
And this is why you cannot teach somebody empathy. And this, I'm sorry, this drives me a little crazy when I'm listening to like social media and they go through steps like how you're going to teach somebody it, like cognitive, and they say this about narcissists. Well, they have, I forgot what they even call it, like cognitive empathy or
Cognitive
something.
empathy.
Yeah,
Mhm.
like they could do that, but they don't really have empathy. And the reason is because you can't teach somebody empathy.
Mhm.
Empathy only comes when I described earlier, when you have somebody who can sit with you when you mess something up and not shame you, not judge you, put an arm
Mhm.
around you, not literally, because I'm thinking of again healing and therapy, because this is what we do all the time, and sit by their side and then just talk to them about what happened. You became quite aggressive with little Sally. I'm fast
Mhm.
forwarding. I know you're not going to speak like that to a child, but in later, because this stuff doesn't
It
change, by the
comes
way.
back
Yes.
later. Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. Okay.
So, I'm not teaching them about empathy. Like, maybe you need to be a little bit more concerned about Sally, but I'm saying, "What happened? You seem to get a little upset with her there, or you acted quite aggressively.
Right.
Let's talk about that." So there's no shame, and that's like the hug or the warmth that went missing when they were younger, and that
Absolutely.
upsets a lot of people, by the way, but I wanted to just get it out there, Renee.
Well, then that's okay. Yeah, when I talk about you mentioned cognitive empathy or what the world is calling cognitive empathy with narcissistically inclined people, I tend to term it performative empathy.
Yes.
They can learn
Yeah.
what they're supposed to do. They can learn the
Yes.
behaviors that they're supposed to have, but that's not gonna change what's going on inside of them.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Which then means they could do it again. You see that?
Mhm.
Whatever the
Mhm.
destructive behavior was, cheating, yelling, devaluing, they could do it again because
Mhm.
internally the structures in the mind are not changing at all. So
Right.
the only way that changes is not the only way, but one of the ways that I find to be most helpful is what I was just describing a moment ago is self-other differentiation, the movement from part objects to whole objects. In other words, that someone has a life of their own separate from yours, and that's very upsetting. But then we need to work through
Mhm.
what's that like for you? That when your spouse has a different opinion, is there any other way to et cetera?
Yeah.
You get the
Yeah.
point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do. So is there any difference between pathological guilt and shame? Are those 2 the same?
They're so closely linked, I don't see the difference, but
Okay.
maybe there is with I think in my mind, I'm always thinking like in terms of treatment or healing. I think that's why I mentioned it several times. I
Mhm.
think the process is going to be more or less the same because the issues are going to be the same. If
Right.
you have pathological guilt, we know somebody's not relating to a whole person. It's a part person who's there just to meet their needs. So in essence, that's going to be the sort of underlying work that needs to get done. And
Mhm.
then on top of that, we're not working on guilt directly or empathy, but then they develop a capacity to have more empathy because they can begin to tolerate that somebody is separate from them.
Okay.
Oh, this is object constancy, by the way. I don't know if you've ever heard of that concept,
Mhm.
but this is object constancy. Object constancy, it's not just that if somebody disappears, that you can't hold an image of them in mind. It's that when someone disagrees with you, that's part of the definition. And something that you believe in very strongly, someone you love has a different opinion, that you could be curious in their opinion and you could tolerate that level of separateness and know that they still love you and you still love them. See, there's the love again,
Right.
the relatedness.
Right.
Yeah.
But that would require being able to be vulnerable with that person. Because to
Yes.
really hear that somebody you love and care about is unhappy with you, for example,
Hmm.
and not go into shame-based thinking
Yes.
is, to me, a sign of emotional growth and emotional maturity.
Yeah, that's why guilt is a developmental achievement. It's amazing if we can help somebody experience guilt and empathy. And that's a slow
Mhm.
process of change because, to your point, you have to be vulnerable.
Mhm.
And that's really hard for people who have personality disorders, narcissists.
This podcast is sponsored by Talkspace. You know, when you're really stressed or not feeling so great about your life or about yourself, talking to someone who understands can really help. But who is that person? How do you find them? Where do you even start? Talkspace. Talkspace makes it easy to get the support you need. With Talkspace, you can go online, answer a few questions about your preferences, and be matched with a therapist. And because you'll meet your therapist online, you don't have to take time off work or arrange childcare. You'll meet on your schedule, wherever you feel most at ease. If you're depressed, stressed, struggling with a relationship, or if you want some counseling for you and your partner, or just need a little extra one-on-one support, Talkspace is here for you. Plus, Talkspace works with most major insurers, and most insured members have a $0 copay. No insurance? No problem. Now get $80 off of your first month with promo code SPACE80 when you go to Talkspace.com. Match with a licensed therapist today at Talkspace.com. Save $80 with code SPACE80 at Talkspace.com.
In particular.
Right.
Yeah.
So a person demonstrating narcissistic traits does not necessarily make them a narcissistic personality disorder.
Yeah, that's right.
There's
The
a
way the
distinction
main
there.
distinguishing feature that I see, and I've spoken about this a lot, so I won't go into it. It's the structure. It's the grandiose sense of self, that whole omnipotent structure that holds them together. We could call it the false self. Like I
Mhm.
said, there are different names for it. But once that is present, because that's not just arrogance and omnipotence, that structure is very complicated, and I've dismantled it. Actually, I just did a 4-part series on healing narcissism, specifically on the grandiose structure. That's the core that holds the fragmented self together. So, yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
what we need to deal with in terms of healing and developing empathy and all the things to get past the shame.
Yes.
Because you're right. If there's shame, now you're going back to earlier level interventions. You're thinking about the treatment process or the healing process a little differently.
Yeah. Yeah, and shame feeds more shame and feeds more shame
Oh,
because then I'm
yeah.
ashamed of having shame, and
Yeah.
it can be very much so a very devastating spiral.
Yeah, that's why they hide out, right? That's why they
Yes.
can't participate in groups, or they'll play sport until a point where they're not the best anymore, then they have to quit. Or
Mhm.
they'll, I don't know, want to graduate top of their class and then they get a bad grade and they're no longer in the top 1 percentile and they give up. There's
Right.
so many different examples of that, but that's
Right.
all shame. That's shame.
If I can't
Yeah.
be perfect or if I can't be the best, then I'm a complete failure.
Exactly. And that's the splitting again. You just said it, right? That's the dichotomous way of thinking. That's the fragmented self. Either
Right.
I'm great, idealized, the best, or I'm nothing unworthy.
I'm
Yeah.
worthless. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well,
Hmm.
I would love
Okay.
to explore in the future
Hmm.
on another episode. I would love to explore what does, what does healing look like for this? Like maybe what happens when we mistake shame for guilt or guilt for shame, and
Mm.
how do we work through that healing process? So if you're open to it, I would love to continue this conversation in future episodes.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, that's a really tricky question and something you see quite commonly. I know because I get patients who come to me after failed treatment approaches and they tell me the way their therapist was treating shame and talking to them about it in a way like no shame in your game, like you just have to it's like more like a motivational speech, and that leaves them feeling unrecognized. You see, again,
Yeah.
that's actually more wounding than it is healing. But anyway, yes, I would love
Yeah.
to hear how you think about it, Renee, and I see if I can contribute anything meaningful as well.
Absolutely. No, I love that. I mean, one of the reflections I have made in just recently in my own past is where I looked back at my past thinking I was raised, with a lot of guilt. I think I look back now and recognize that it was not guilt, it was shame.
Oh, that's amazing. That's really helpful because if we do this part two, which I'm very interested in, what I could do is maybe we could talk about, and I know I can, people who come to me saying, I feel so guilty because, and I'll explain why. But it turns out as we get much closer, it is not guilt.
It's not
It's
guilt.
shamed. And that
Yeah.
it's shame. And that's why they never move beyond it because guilt, remember you said it, it's reparative, it's forward moving. You said it
Mhm.
earlier.
Mhm.
So you can move beyond guilt, but shame, you can't.
You
And
can't
that
move
study
past
that
it.
I mentioned earlier about the callousness, they showed that this stuff doesn't change unless there's some kind of intervention, that they grow up not experiencing guilt, but feeling shame instead.
Yeah. Well, one of the ways that I encourage people to explore what they're feeling is when they tell me I feel so guilty. I try to get them to be very clear on verbalizing what exactly is it then that you did wrong.
Mhm, mhm.
What did you do wrong? And if they can't verbalize something, okay, I forgot to take the trash out. And that caused this massive, argument and circular conversation for hours in my home. I'm like, wait a minute. Did the circular conversation come because you forgot to take the trash out? Or did this come because of the environment and the defensiveness in the
Mm,
relationship that's there? So if I say, I feel so guilty about, simple example, but if I feel so guilty about not taking the trash out, I try to get them to really understand, what is it that you did wrong? Is
yes.
that wrong, or is that just being human, you know?
Yeah. That's a wonderful, wonderful approach. And it really ties in nicely something we spoke about earlier when we were thinking about shame is the unnameable. So what you just said is I try to help them articulate
Mhm.
in detail what happened. And then what you realize, they may not be able to do that, but that's more commonly shame because shame oftentimes doesn't have the words to express
Yes.
itself. So, and
Yes.
that's part of the treatment as well, or the healing process is giving it giving it words to get it out of you.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Which is crucial for healing. I mean,
Hmm.
awareness is steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 in your healing journey. So, all right. Well, Dr. Mazzella, thank you so much for this conversation. I look forward to more, and I just thank you for
Yeah.
all of the knowledge and all of the awareness that you share.
It was my pleasure. I always look forward to talking to you and expanding my own level of awareness too. So thank you, Renee.
Well, thank you. And
Okay.
everyone out there listening, I wish you so much peace on your journey of healing. As we wrap up this powerful two-part conversation with Dr. Anthony Mazzella, I want to thank you for staying with us through such an important and often deeply personal topic. Shame and guilt are complex emotions and experiences that can feel like chains, especially for survivors of covert narcissistic abuse. They distort our self perception, silence our truth, and keep us stuck in cycles of self blame. But as Dr. Mazzella so beautifully illustrated, understanding these emotions is the first step towards releasing them and reclaiming our sense of self. If today's discussion resonated with you, I highly recommend checking out Dr. Mazzella's podcast, Narcissism Decoder. It's a compassionate and insightful resource for anyone navigating the lasting effects of narcissistic abuse. And it dives even deeper into the emotional and psychological patterns that we touched on here. As always, if you're ready to take the next step in your own healing journey, I invite you to explore my coaching services at covertnarcissism.com. Whether you're rebuilding after abuse or learning how to trust yourself again, you don't have to do it alone. Be sure to subscribe to the Covert Narcissism podcast to continue to get episodes just like these. I ask you please also to leave a rating, leave a review. That helps so much for us to continue this mission of helping our world. Your story matters, your healing matters, and you deserve to move forward without shame, without guilt, and fully in your truth. Until next time, take care of that heart of yours. You are worthy of peace, and I wish you so much peace on your journey of healing. You have been listening to the Covert Narcissism podcast, where we break apart the insidious nature of these incredibly destructive and frustrating to the ends of the earth individuals. If you are struggling with the isolation, overwhelming self-doubt, and obsessive ruminating, you are not alone. I offer live, personalized coaching that is specific for you. This coaching can be individual or group sessions, or a combination of the two. You can find all the information at covertnarcissism.com. Reach out anytime. My email address is Renee, Renee, at covertnarcissism.com. And remember, I am not a therapist and you are not a victim, but I am a coach and you are a survivor. The information provided by Renee Swanson, Covert Narcissism Podcast, and CNG Life Coaching is for educational purposes only and is not to be used for diagnosis purposes. It is not intended to be a substitute for clinical care. Please consult a health care provider for guidance specific to your case. This material discusses narcissism in general. Renee shares stories from her personal experience as well as from those she has talked with for several years. Her material does not claim that any specific person has narcissism and should not be used to refer to any specific person as having narcissism. Permission is not granted to link to or repost this material to support any allegation or claim that any specific person is a narcissist. That would be an unauthorized misuse of the material and information provided.